Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Georgetown. I'm Angela Stent. I'm director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our dean, Dr. Joel Hellman. Dr. Hellman started off his life as an academic specializing in Russia and Central Asia. He worked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development after teaching at Harvard and Columbia. And then he spent, I think, a little more than 20 years at the World Bank, working on fragile states and other issues. And now he is the Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and we're delighted to welcome you here today.
Thank you, Angela. You said that I started my career studying Russia and Central Asia. At the time, we called it the Soviet Union. Which says something about my age. When you're a bald man, you don't have the gray hairs to sort of show your age. But I did start, I actually started my career with an area studies degree, actually as an undergraduate in Soviet studies, with a particular interest in history, and in particular the history of the Russian Revolution. I began graduate school at Oxford University in 1985, a year that some of you might remember as the year that Mikhail Gorbachev came General Secretary of the Communist Party, and began what would unfold an enormous change, to say the least, in the region. I was studying the history of the Russian Revolution, and my history teacher, my history don at the time, turned to me and said, "Well, why are you studying the revolution in 1917? Looks like a revolution may be starting here. Why don't you study politics instead of history?" And indeed I did, and it started a fascinating trajectory of looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rebirth and reimagination of the Eurasian space. And here we are today, 25 years sort of later, and a tremendous range of economic, political, socio-cultural sort of changes have occurred. I, unfortunately, for the last more than almost 15, 20 years, about 15 years, really have been much less engaged actively in the study of Russia and Eurasia. I've spent most of the remainder of my career in Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, working on conflict and development issues. But nevertheless, a sort of strong part of my intellectual and emotional heart remains in Eurasia. Coming back to academia after many years at the World Bank, one of the particular pleasures is to come back to Georgetown, which has had such a historically important relationship and engagement in the study of what was then the Soviet Union and now Russia and Eurasia. And great to reconnect with many people that I worked with and knew from my early days looking at these issues. What strikes me as someone returning to the United States, I've also been abroad, living abroad for the last 15 years. What strikes me as returning to the United States and returning and re-engaging in the issues of Russia and Eurasia is, I think, what a decline we have seen in the quality of discussion, public discussion, not in terms of the scholarly discussion, but the public discussion and thinking about Russia, Eastern Europe, Eurasia. I am struck and in some days dumbstruck by the quality of the public discussion, the perceptions, the rhetoric that's used, the extent to which there's debate and understanding of perceptions from a variety of different regions. And although here in the United States, although many of my colleagues, graduate student colleagues of mine, I went to school with Mike McFall. I was a colleague of Celeste Wallender's, who's now in the White House. We had offices next door to each other at Harvard. Rory McFarker, who's an important figure in the NSC, was a student of mine at Harvard. And so one would be hard-pressed to say that the people who are, at least in the United States, who are putting inputs into U.S. policymaking are certainly people who have a long and deep engagement and understanding in the region. And yet, the quality of the public dialogue, I think, has really deteriorated. And I think it's extremely troubling. I think one only needs to listen today, for example, over the last couple of days, the rollout of the United States policy towards increasing support to Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. And whether you think about the nature of that decision, what strikes me is the nature of the rhetoric in which it is being discussed, and a misunderstanding perhaps of perceptions, how others will be understanding and perceiving and thinking about that sort of set of decisions, and how that's communicated. It's striking to me. And that's especially why I'm so pleased that we're here today, bringing, I think, a deeper understanding of the Eurasian Union, the relationships across the new states of the post-Soviet space, and in particular that this conference takes such a multi-hued perspective on that issue. What makes me proud of being here at Georgetown is that in addition to the depth of scholarship that we bring, we convene. And what we are convening here, and it's clear, is scholars from, I see here, you've got Russian, China, Britain, Sweden, Germany, looking at just a various range of perspectives on what's happening in this post-Soviet space. And that we're looking at that perspective, not only from a US perspective, but from a Russian perspective, from a Chinese perspective. I understand on the program you have from a Kazakh perspective. I think that's absolutely critical to understanding these issues. In particular, as well, keeping the best traditions of Georgetown, you're also looking at these issues from a multidisciplinary perspective, which I think is critical, from the political, the economic, the geopolitical, the security. That's going to help us deepen, strengthen the understanding, and hopefully contribute to greater public understanding of these issues. And I think that's what I'm hoping to come out of your discussion today. And one of the great advantages that we have at Georgetown of doing this is that when we have these discussions, of course they enrich us, they enrich the people who are participating, but because we're in Washington, D.C., because we are part and parcel of where many of these policy issues are discussed, hopefully there is greater resonance to the conclusions in some of the broader public space, the policy dialogue, the public dialogue, to enrich that dialogue, and actually, I think, to reflect the understanding that we've developed about Eurasia and the post-Soviet space over the course of these last 10 years. So I'm particularly pleased to welcome you here for that purpose. I personally wish that I could be with you and hear some of the conclusions and debates that you're having during the course of the day. Unfortunately, I've got 3 other conferences to sort of start up this very day. I guess it's conference season at Georgetown and at my old stomping grounds in the World Bank. But know that I am deeply grateful to you for joining us. Deeply grateful for you to participating and engaging in what we think is an absolutely critical dialogue going forward. I also want to reiterate, as an incoming dean here at the School of Foreign Service, which has traditionally been a leader in convening these kinds of dialogues and a leader in our understanding of area studies, and really trying to understand a region from multiple perspectives. I do want to emphasize how I want to recommit this school, the School of Foreign Service and Georgetown University, to that approach to studying this region, and how important it is to our future. Our school is actually coming up on our 100th anniversary. We're the oldest school of international affairs, specific school of international affairs in the United States. And as we think about what the next century should be, how do we train and educate global citizens in the next century? We have a tremendous base to build upon, but we're also thinking about the relevance and the models of education that we would think about. And I remain very much committed to the approach that you're representing in this conference today, which is multidisciplinary, multi-perspective, bringing scholars and practitioners in from various different parts of the world to really try to deal with a complex, politically charged set of issues, but that are absolutely sort of central to our security, to our prosperity, peace, and global stability. So I really welcome you here. I wish you a successful day of deliberation and discussion. I'm eager to hear what you come out with. I hope you find it enriching, and I do hope that it enriches our dialogue in Washington, around the United States, and more broadly on this issue. I also want to, and I would be remiss if I didn't, thank those who are actually helping to put this conference on, financing it, the Chevron Corporation, the Transatlantic Academy of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I really want to thank them sincerely for their sort of support for this conference. And I want to thank Angela and Michael David Fox and CERES for putting this on. So I wish you a successful day. Thank you for coming. And I hope you have an enjoyable as well as enriching set of discussions. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Michael David Fox. I'm the interim director of CERES. And I'd also like to welcome you. Dean Hellman emphasized the multidisciplinary perspective that we attempted to give to this conference, the economic, political, geopolitical, security, and so on. And to that list, I would like to add historical. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Mark Basson, because he's uniquely qualified to give us some historical perspective on how classical Eurasianism compares to today's variations. Mark is the Baltic Sea professor of the history of ideas at Söderholm University in Stockholm. He has held appointments in Birmingham, University College London, Wisconsin-Madison, Chicago, and Copenhagen. His overarching scholarly interest lies in concepts of space and nature in political theory in the 19th and 20th centuries, with special focus on Russia and Germany. And perhaps the best known of his many publications is the book Imperial Visions, Nationalist Imagination and Geographical Expansion in the Russian Far East, which came out with the Cambridge Studies in Historical Geography in 2006. And in his recent research, he's focused on the German science of Geopolitics and the Russian movement of Eurasianism. And most recently, he was co-editor of the 2015 book Between Europe and Asia, The Origins, Theories, and Legacies of Russian Eurasianism. And his keynote address this morning is entitled A Century of Eurasianism, the Evolution of an Ideology. So,
thanks very much for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. It's a little daunting to open such an august and important meeting, but I'm very pleased to be in this position. I was asked by Michael to talk about Eurasianism in Russia today. Sorry. I was asked to talk about Eurasianism in Russia today, that is to say Neo-Eurasianism, in the light of its historical origins and evolution across the 20th century. This is a very congenial challenge for me. As Michael has explained, I'm a historian of ideas, a historian of ideologies, I would even say. And for me, the history of ideas involves the study of the constant playoff, or you might even say dialectic, between continuity and change. How ideologies evolve in response to evolving historical and political contexts, and to try to glean some sense of what that scenario actually means. The development of Eurasianism, which began its life in the immediate post-World War I era in the very early 1920s, down to the Neo-Eurasianism of our own day, offers a particularly rich and fascinating example of this process. And the challenge for me as a historian is to trace this evolution. The question of continuity and fidelity, you might say, within an ideological tradition is important not only to nerdish historians of ideas like myself. I think it has a much deeper and you might even say a functional significance, because one way the ideology seeks to establish its legitimacy is via claims, precisely via claims of fidelity to founding principles. One might even talk about a mystique of doctrinal origins. And for a good example of this, which always comes to my mind, you need go no further than American political discourse and the constant trope of the founding fathers, which is constantly evoked in a very broad galaxy of different views to try to lay a claim to a kind of legitimacy and validity. Legitimacy and credibility in the present day, this reference to these, as I say, doctrinal origins. Now, Neo-Eurasianism is an excellent example, I think, of precisely this, this phenomenon. It might be possible for some of you to remember when Neo-Eurasianism first began to come onto the scene in the 1990s. It had its proponents at that time were located largely to the you might say extremist kind of red-brown fringe of opposition to the Yeltsin government. And there was one individual in particular by the name of Alexander Dugin, who's gone on to become quite famous, and many of you have heard of him. But from the outset, that is from the 1990s, when he wasn't very famous, except to people like myself and a couple of others who had always been interested in these ideas, from the outset, an essential aspect of his promotional strategy was precisely an ambitious publication project. He set up his own printing press, set up his own publishing house, and he issued a series, not quite a library, but a large shelf of the founding texts. He republished the founding texts of the classical Eurasianists that I'll be talking about from the 1920s and the 1930s. And even to people like myself who knew this literature to some extent, a lot of these were already unknown. And this turned out to be a very effective way. These are just kind of classics. This makes Eurasianism then very available to everybody. And it's a very effective way. It worked very effectively for him in establishing, you might say, a guardianship of the legacy of Eurasianism and thereby enhancing his own credibility for what he, and legitimacy for what he is trying to do. So what I want to talk about briefly today is to consider this question of legacy. I will try to keep my comments short, really offer a sort of summary overview and no particularly definitive conclusions. I really want to just lay out a series of points for you to try to set up the problem and identify some aspects, some significant aspects of the playoff between continuity and transformation in Eurasianism. Now, any discussion of post-Soviet Neo-Eurasianism has to begin with a disclaimer. Of course, there are many Eurasianisms on offer today. That wasn't so much the case in the past, but it certainly is true today. Just to name some of the versions that are very popular in Russia, you have three names that you'll be familiar with probably. Then I'll be mentioning briefly in my talk. Dugin, I've already mentioned, Lev Gumilyov, and Vladimir Putin. Three names, and all different. If you go beyond Russia and Kazakhstan, of course, you have the whole Nazarbayevian project of Eurasianism in Tatarstan, Mintimir Shaimiev, the old president, now Minikhanov, all supporting this. They're all different, and one could go on to name many others that you might not have heard of. And I'm certainly not going to try to explain what the differences are today. I will mention, as I said, a couple of these names. Please just keep in mind that Neo-Eurasianism is not quite one unified corpus of ideas. First, I want to discuss briefly the continuities between classical Eurasianism and Neo-Eurasianism. I'll talk about two that I think are both quite fundamental and important. To begin with is the vision of Eurasia as a cohesive multinational community of fraternal peoples. The belief that the great masses of the populations, both of the former empire, because we're talking about the immediate post-revolutionary period, and the Soviet Union, these populations shared deep affinities and connections, and they were affinities that survived the process of geopolitical fragmentation. Fragmentation in 1917 and fragmentation in 1991. There was a de facto coherence, and the de facto coherence and unity of these different groups remained undiminished through the trauma of fragmentation and dissolution. In this regard, Eurasianism was and Eurasianism remains a civilizational discourse. It viewed Russia as a civilization
a Weltkultur famously described in the 20th century in the classics of Oswald Spengler, Arnold Toynbee, and others. Indeed, the first volume of Spengler, the famous Untergang des Abendlandes, was published in 1918, and the first Eurasianist manifesto, this is Nikolai Trubetskoy's Evropa и Человечество, appeared 2 years later. And it was a response, in a sense, to Spengler, in a way. It developed, he accepted these ideas and developed them further. The civilizational idea developed it further and applied it to Russia. Russia was a mnogonarodnaya lичность, a multinational personality, a collection of varying groups that all came together to form one entity. The civilizational discourses have come back into fashion. In the post-Cold War world, of course, we know the particularly influential statement, a very important one, Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. And once again, Neo-Eurasianism today embraces this perspective. And indeed, there's a very strong resonance in Neo-Eurasianism of Huntington. And if one looks at the work of Gumilyov, Lev Gumilyov, who I mentioned, who was sort of an inspirer. He died in 1992, but his works kind of inspired the whole Neo-Eurasianist movement. He's intensely Huntingtonian in his notion of not simply the existence of civilizations, but the enmity, the clash between them. This means that both for classical as well as Neo-Eurasianism, the unity of the Eurasian peoples is based not on ethnic or ethno-national affinities, but rather on nebulous civilizational empathies that are shared among the various nations and national groups that bind them together, again, into this lичность, into this single entity. Bound by shared social and cultural values, by shared historical experiences, and so on. Effectively, what used to be called a Schicksalsgemeinschaft, a community of destiny. The second commonality between the classical and the contemporary period follows directly on this, and that is that in both cases, the fact of this Общность, the fact of this commonality, dictated and still today dictates what must be the primary and the overriding geopolitical dynamic and imperative, you might say, for the country, and this is the imperative for geopolitical unity. Central Eurasianism took shape as a reaction to the territorial fragmentation of the Russian imperial state in the wake of the 1917 revolution, when the imperial periphery, the years following the revolution, the late the teens and then the early 1920s, when the imperial periphery began to detach itself from the corpus of the old empire. The Baltic states, of course, Ukraine, Crimea, autonomy movements on the Volga, in Central Asia, Turkestan, the Caucasus, everywhere. There were movements to some degree of success, movements for autonomy and independence. The classical Eurasians had not opposed the revolution. They accepted the destruction of the old regime. But their first demand was that the new post-revolutionary and post-imperial state had to reassemble the traditional spaces of Russian nationhood into a single geopolitical corpus, back into a single state. So they accepted the political destruction of the old regime, but they did not accept the geopolitical destruction of the old regime, of the old empire, and Russia, Eurasia of the future must once again be Velikaya, but more importantly, must again be Nedelimaya. Neo-Eurasianism, in an almost uncanny manner, I would say, emerged under similar circumstances. That is to say, the territorial fragmentation of the Soviet state. And on the basis of a similar vision of Russia as a mnogonarodnaya общность, they put forward a similar demand, and that is to reconnect the territories of Eurasian civilization. A reenactment of the same calculation that we saw in the 1920s, that is to say, an acceptance of the political destruction of the Soviet state by all means, but a rejection and an attempt to reverse the geopolitical fragmentation of that state. So you have two fundamental elements here of continuity between the early classical and the neo versions of Eurasianism. They're very important, I think, they're quite significant, but they're counterbalanced by significant differences as well. And here I will list three. The first point relates to matters that are internal to Eurasian society. As I pointed out, for both classical and neo-Eurasianism, Eurasian civilization is a collection of fraternal peoples. Geopolitical cohesion, the reconnection of these groups, is essential, but this cohesion and the reconnection must be based on a respect of ethno-cultural differences. So the Eurasianist attitude is not colonialist in this sense. Again, they welcome the destruction precisely of the colonial state. It is not colonialist, let's call it post-colonialist. Whatever that might mean. That's not so simple, but certainly deliberately trying to move forward. But the fundamental fact remains. Russians, ethnic Russians, Velika, great Russians, form the biggest and the strongest of these groups, and indeed have a unique ancient legacy, ancient, that is to say, of many centuries old, of dominant and controlling authority within the Russian state. So the challenge then is how to manage the balance of power between, on the one hand, the old colonial, we might say, masters or dominators, and everybody else. Now here, classical Eurasianism, I think there are differences that we can note, and I think that they're significant. As I said, classical Eurasianism rejected the empire. It was sort of saw itself as a post-imperial movement determined to overcome the colonial legacy. This was a tension which I have to say, as a footnote, was never completely resolved. Even in classical Eurasianism, if you read the text carefully, they do talk sometimes about Russians as the first among equals. They've never completely solved this tension, but in principle, the principle, that is to say, of equality and post-colonial equality was incredibly important. And one of the most important formulators of Eurasianist doctrines, that is Nikolai Trubetskoy, wrote what to my mind a brief but quite extraordinary essay in 1927, which he called, he gave it a very strange title, Общеевразийский национализм, Pan-Eurasian nationalism. And in this essay, Trubetskoy insisted quite emphatically that Russians could no longer, great Russians now, could no longer think of themselves as the dominating. They had done that up to that point, but they could no longer think of themselves as the dominating nationality in this multinational group. Now the Russians, he said, and he said this very clearly, we are just one among many. And his conclusions here, to make the point as clear as he could, was to call upon the Russians to surrender the very principle of Russian nationalism. And instead, from now on, he said that everyone must embrace this общеевразийский nationalism. So Russian nationalism would go, and pan-Eurasian nationalism would take its place. Neo-Eurasianism today, I think, is very different. It might be related to the fact that today there are very significant non-Russian actors in the movement and groups in the movement. I've already mentioned Tatarstan, for example, and Kazakhstan. There are others as well. This was not so much the case before. And there is still a tension in Neo-Eurasianism. There's still an endorsement, of course, of the principle of equality. This is very important, the evils of imperial domination, of national chauvinism. But in fact, the positions and the substance of the discourse, I think, today is quite different. A great majority of the Russian Neo-Eurasianist ideologues are clear and emphatic that Eurasianism, in their view, Neo-Eurasianism, is a project precisely for re-establishing the dominant leading position of the Russian nationality, a domination that was lost, and here the Soviet period is important because this was a feeling that that domination of the Russian element had been lost in the Soviet Union. And now, so they claim in the USSR, now it was to get and Neo-Eurasianism is a means to take this back. They describe Russia in various terms. It's the stержень, the backbone of the Eurasian community. The Russians are a государство образующий народ, a government-forming peoples or nationality which is charged, has always been and remains today charged with the ведущий роль, the leading role of organizing the Eurasian, or reorganizing the Eurasian community. One can even find the president, Vladimir Putin, speaking in these terms. Of course, to be sure, in a modulated, more diplomatic fashion than others, for example, Dugin, and he says other things as well, but you do find these terms that I've just said coming up in his pronouncements. The undertone is clear. So you have a paradox. So I'm saying that you have this undertone, and well, with Putin, an undertone with most of the other Russian Neo-Eurasians. It's not an undertone at all. of a kind of wanting to reclaim a leading role. And this leads to a paradox, and that is that in Kazakhstan, in Tatarstan, other non-Russian areas, where the government endorses a version of Eurasianism, and this is an official doctrine, you have popular discourses, and they're quite significant ones, that actually oppose Eurasianism precisely because they see it as a means of Russia, as a, you might say, ideological foil on the part of Russian nationalists, precisely like Alexander Dugin, a foil for Russian, what is in fact Russian aggrandizement. The second and the third distinctions, differences from the classical tradition that I want to talk about relate to Eurasia's relationship with the external world. Classical Eurasianism was a strongly isolationist doctrine. The classical Eurasians called themselves continentalists, and this perspective was developed particularly by Savitsky, Pyotr Nikolaevich Savitsky, who was a geographer, and in the 1920s wrote many pieces, very interesting ones, I think, although ultimately not terribly convincing, but very fascinating attempts to try to establish this kind of quintessential continental identity for Russia. Geographically, he argued Russia is continental space. And the geographical fact of continentality is an essential and immutable aspect of its identities. Russia is cut off as a continental space. It is cut off from the oceans. It's surrounded on the south and the east by mountain ranges. In the north, of course, there's an ocean, but it happens to be frozen, so that also is enhances the continentality. And because of its continental nature, Russia could never compete as a maritime power. It could never compete militarily or economically. This, they point out in passing, was Peter the Great's, and indeed modern Russia's great mistake that they ever thought that Peter, who banked on the development of a navy, in a sense, is a symbolic act of westernization and becoming part of Europe. Savitsky and the other Eurasians argued that Russia's political and economic development, that is Russia-Eurasia's political and economic development in the future, needed to reflect this objective geographical, geopolitical reality. And that meant that it should prioritize the economic and political integration of its internal spaces, with the goal of ultimately creating self-sufficiency and a sort of isolation, and a very far-reaching isolation from the rest of the world, from the outside world. And the model here they operated with in the 1920s and 1930s was a model of economic and political autarky. Now, of course, if you, knowing the history of this particular period in Europe, there were very powerful resonances between what the Eurasians were saying, what Savitsky and others were saying, and other parts of interwar Europe. You have, for example, a very strong German vision of autarky with this idea of Mitteleuropa, which the Eurasianists borrowed from conceptually, very enthusiastically, but it was also in the Soviet Union at the same time. You had this notion of socialism in a single country, which resonated in some ways. I mean, of course, there was not a geopolitical basis, geographical sort of determinist basis for it, but nevertheless, the reality, the effect was in some ways very similar. There's a notable corollary to this point about continentalism and isolationism, and it meant that, and that is that the principle of messianism, which one associates always with the tradition of Russian nationalism, was very modulated among the classical Eurasians. It was there, again, if you look carefully you can find it, but it was never pressed very much, and I think the doctrines are quite striking in following the consequences of this isolationist perspective, in a sense, to their logical end. Neo-Eurasianism also promotes, of course, internal consolidation, internal integration of the post-Soviet spaces. In a sense, that's the first thing that it is all about. But at the same time, its attention is directed externally. The external, and it always involves external, you might call them outreach engagements, as an integral part of the project. This is very clear if one just looks more specifically at the thinking behind the organization of the Eurasian Economic Union, this political movement that we're dealing with today. It was already, when the idea was first launched, and this was not in Russia, but this was in Kazakhstan, because it was Nazarbayev's idea for a long time to begin with, in the mid-1990s, the vision was quite explicit. Not only the inspiration from the European Union, and taking the European Union as a kind of model for what Nazarbayev wanted to accomplish, but also beyond that, a prospect of positive alignment with the European Union. This was repeated then when Putin finally made his famous statement, or at least to me, the other Eurasianist enthusiasts know this quite well. This was the 3rd of October, 2011, in the course of his presidential campaign for the 3rd term, when in Izvestia he made the statement in support. Finally, he came, as I would say, out of the closet on Eurasia, and he had supported this for a long time, but now has, is no longer trying to maintain deniability. 2011, the statement, pre-Ukraine invasion, pre-Crimea, pre-sanctions, and in this statement, Putin underscored the synergies between the EU, European Union, that could be the potential, I should say, the potential synergies between his project for the Eurasian Union and for the European Union. And he spoke in these terms in Izvestia in 2011, the notion of a unified economic space from Dublin, no, he said not Dublin, Lisbon, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And these are his words in this statement. Quite striking, if you think about it, in terms of today. So you have, on the one hand, an openness to Europe, always, in the, of one sort or another, at least it's there, in the Eurasianist project. You also have an openness in the other direction, of course, the pivot to Asia, the pivot to China, that has become quite outspoken recently. And this, again, I don't want to say anything deeper about this. There are far greater specialists we'll hear from later on today. But what this establishes then is the elasticity of the Eurasia concept, where Eurasianism can also mean, well, it can mean also alliance, affinities, outreach beyond, way beyond Russia to China and even further. So there's nothing isolationist, in other words, about the Eurasianist project that we have today. How am I doing? Do I have time, or should I skip? I have a little bit more to go. Okay, I'll just end this. I have one more point to make about the third difference, but just to conclude on this question about isolationism, I wanted to talk a little bit about Dugin, who is actually, in a sense, has a very clearly expansionist program, and this is very clear. The Eurasianist Union is not organized based on that, but in Dugin's case, you have this very strong. The final point that I want to make, related to this, again, dealing with external relations, and that is that dealing with the specific, and to me this is because I'm interested in how geographical regions are understood and how they're ideologized, this I find particularly fascinating, and this is the specific understanding of the West. That is, what is, что такое Запад? And на самом деле, где Запад? Where is the West? Well, it turns out it's not so straightforward. We all thought this was simple, but it's not. Now, on this point, classical Eurasianism, 1920s, 1930s, was thoroughly faithful to the historical legacies out of which it developed, and that is, of course, the legacy of 19th century Russian nationalism and Russian pan-Slavism. The chief inspirations in this regard for classical Eurasians, and they acknowledged these, Dostoevsky, names that we're all familiar with, Dostoevsky, Danilevsky, Leontiev, who embraced the notion of Russia, the difference between Russia and the West, as different cultural historical types, what the 20th century would call, as I've already mentioned, civilizations. Indeed, there were not just differences between them, but they were actually antipathies between them. It was confrontational, and at all times, the West was acted as, and continued in the present to act as, Russia's antithesis, its nemesis. The West was always Russia's principal threat. This antipathy had been the most fundamental condition of Russia's historical existence, and in the future it would continue to be. That's familiar. There's nothing. That's very standard. Eurasianism is not being very radical in that regard. That's a very well-known, well-established notion. However, Neo-Eurasianism, if we try to put this into the same calculation and see what it's talking about, is ambivalent. Because Neo-Eurasianism can embrace anti-Westernism, of course, maybe primarily it embraces anti-Westernism, there's no question about this, but it is by no means the only option for it. One can come back to Vladimir Putin himself. Of course, today, after all of the recent events, his anti-Westernism, for the moment, is not in question. But if we listen and go back once again to 2012, if I can just quote once again from his project as he laid this out in Izvestia, quote, "As we developed the idea of a Eurasian Union, we proposed to the Europeans to think together about the creation of a harmonious community of economies, about a zone of free trade, and even more advanced forms of integration." That is to say, precisely this notion of a unified economic space, somehow from Lisbon to the Pacific. An even more striking example here of this ambivalence, or this ability to think about the West in different terms, is Alexander Dugin, who has completely reconceptualized, I would say, the classical Eurasianist antipathy to the West. In his view, the principal enemy of Russia today is not Western Europe at all. This was the principal enemy, without any question, for the classical Eurasians, speaking in the Russian tradition, but this is no longer the case for Alexander Dugin. He sees it differently. In his view, the principal enemy of Russia are its Atlanticism, what he calls Atlanticism, the Atlanticist powers, the United States, of course, primarily, plus its allies, the UK and assorted others. Of course, what Dugin is doing is placing classical Eurasian on a model of Cold War confrontation. He's simply, in a way, he's rewriting the Cold War arrangement in Eurasianist terms. But the shift of this displacement of emphasis across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States serves to redefine the geographical sense of the West itself. Europe, Western Europe, ceases to be Russia's antithesis, its anti-type against which it had always defined itself. Instead, it becomes an intermediate, what is effectively an intermediate zone, a weak zone, subject to the external contestation of these two continental on the one hand and maritime Atlanticist powers, external powers on the other, torn effectively between Russia, Eurasia, and the United States. He argues further than this. Western Europe shares Russia, Eurasia's interest in resisting American influence. And to the extent that Western Europe is prepared to recognize this objective commonality, this geopolitical commonality between them, to that extent, it becomes Russia's natural ally. Quite literally, Western Europe can be seen as a part of Eurasia, and this is how Dugin, at the end of the day, thinks about it. This rapprochement, if you want to call it that, with Europe is an absolutely fundamental revision, it seems to me, not only of Eurasianism, but indeed of traditional Russian nationalism. You have a very new idea coming in here, and I'm unaware of precedents. Experts can inform me about precedents in Russian national thinking, but I'm unaware of them. And indeed, this idea about Europe and Russia-Eurasia sharing effectively a civilizational challenge from of resistance to Americanism is not a native Russian notion at all. Rather, Dugin takes it quite openly from the ideology of the contemporary New Right in Europe. These are friends of his, colleagues of his. He, from the beginning, from the early 1990s, he was inspired by them equally as he was by the Russian Eurasianist tradition. I'm thinking here, and these are non-Russian theoreticians. In the Cold War, there was this whole notion of Russia and Western Europe in resistance to Americanism was developed by a Belgian neo-fascist by the name of Thiriard, Jean Thiriard. It's being developed today, well, by many people, but one proponent of it is Alain de Benoit, the famous guru of the French New Right and in general of the New Right. These are Benoit's, I don't want to call him a friend of Dugin, but he's a colleague. Dugin has had him into Moscow on numerous occasions. These ideas are also represented by activists, of course, on the New Right and the radical right in European politics. I'll just mention the Le Pen family as one example of people of politicians now, political forces that are thinking in these lines. In all cases, in any event, driven by the same visceral anti-Americanism. And Dugin, under the ideological canopy of Eurasianism, as he has now reformulated it, can embrace this as well. Okay, I've probably gone on long enough. I'll end here. I just wanted to offer a few observations about continuities and changes in Eurasianist thinking. I noted at the outset, it's very interesting for me as a historian of ideas and ideologies to trace this type of uneven, and beguiling evolutionary process, but at the same time, the historical dimension, so interesting for nerds like myself, is also important, I think, I would like to think for a fuller understanding of the more practical political significance of these ideas in Russia today, and that is what we will spend the rest of the day talking about. So thank you very much. Do we have a few minutes? Okay. I'm happy to have. Yeah, please.
Yes, I'd like to ask. Could you just identify yourself?
Halford Mackinder. Okay, yeah, no, well, that's a very, very, very big question. It's an excellent question. I'm happy to speak privately, perhaps. I can go into some detail. It's something I know a lot about. Just to put it briefly, Mackinder, of course, is one of the important formulators of classical geopolitics. He had a theory writing in the early 20th and early and mid 20th centuries. He had a theory of the heartland, which was very important. It then became a part of Cold War strategic thinking in the United States. Mackinder was never noted by the Russians. That's another story I can talk about, but the geopolitics was never noted until the Soviet Union collapsed, and then the old taboos were gone, and geopolitics, this classical became very fascinating. They thought, well, maybe instead of Marxism, we can use this as a state ideology. And Dugin is very much to be understood as one of the enthusiasts. So Dugin is extremely enthusiastic for Mackinder, and this notion of the heartland, which, of course, they interpret in a sense to the. But the point about Mackinder, I would say, that's important here is that Mackinder's theory was a theory of Eurasian, but I don't mean Russia-Eurasia. Now I mean larger, Europe plus Asia. So there's the entire Eurasian continent, of continental unity. He was the first one to have mentioned the idea that you could have Eurasia, what the post-Cold War period would know as the hegemon, the Eurasian hegemon, that this was a possibility. This was in his imagination. And so in that sense, of course, then he influenced the Germans, he influenced the Nazis and the German geopoliticians with their idea of the continental bloc with the Soviet Union, between the Soviet Union and Germany. Which then lay behind the alliance, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement from 1939 to 1941. It was important there, and then now taken over by people like, and also among others, he's popular everywhere, Mackinder. He always is perennially popular. But also the notion of maritime and continental. To sort of think through the geopolitics of that, that's also. But I won't say more. I'm very happy to talk with you afterwards. There's a lot. I've written an article, actually, about Mackinder in Russia, so we can talk about that. Yes?
On your latest comments, I didn't hear your whole speech. I'm sorry for that. But on the comments you made about Dugin, this always occurs in an international context, whether either of these trends become hegemonic within a country. And I think what you have to look at is what is happening internationally with the U.S. and with Russia. What you said about Dugin's comments, I think, stem from the old fear of Russia of the British Empire. Yes. That goes back to the Tsarist times. Yes. Stalin had it. Stalin was really pro-American, but he didn't trust the British. But America was different in those days. Today we don't. It's not John Quincy Adams. It's not Franklin Roosevelt. We have adopted a lot of the attitudes of the hegemon that the British were during the last century, and that has created a situation in which these are allowed to grow. Yeah. Mackinder himself, I just want to comment, put out his theory because the British idea was that if this alliance that Sergei Witte had created between Russia, Germany, and France to create peace.
It would be the end.
That had to be destroyed.
That would destroy it.
Right?
Absolutely.
So that we have to see. So somehow we kind of provoke this ourselves in many respects. Maybe you want to comment on that.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's absolutely right. I mean, just to point out that's the way it is. Mackinder talked about this possible alliance, the creation of this kind of continental, but again, greater continental unity as the threat to the British Empire, the threat to the free world and so on. Karl Haushofer and the Germans read Mackinder. We know this, and among others. It wasn't only Mackinder, but I mean, Mackinder was one formulation, one particularly effective formulation of this idea, and they came to they agreed. They said, yes, this could be a kind of global power, but we have to create it rather than we have to prevent it, which is what Mackinder wanted. In Versailles, he was arguing for the cordon sanitaire, the band of independent nation states that would keep the two apart. 1919, the Germans in 1935 and 1939 said, no, we have to create this alliance, and that was what they were supporting. So the same geopolitical logic, but going in a different way. Yes, sorry, you had a, yes.
Thank you, Professor Marco Besson, Fen Shanlai from Shanghai, China. I'm very interested in your speech. I think from point of view intellectual history to look at some of the current development that is very interesting dimension. We have some interest.
Yes.
And my question is that when you talk something about Alexander Dugin, do you think how the impact of Alexander Dugin's thing on the Putin's choice, Putin's behavior, and what kind of similarities and also difference between both? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very good but very difficult question, and I don't think I can offer a definitive answer to it. There are, again, I have colleagues in the room I know who know more about this particular. Maybe this will come up later on in the day. The one, I mean, clearly Dugin has been ascendant because he moved from what was the fringe, the radical kind of esoterist fringe in the 1990s to he's become very mainstream now. So that says something, I think, about the way in which his Eurasianist thinking meshes with the attitudes in Russia under the successive Putin regimes, becoming more than that. Then it was culminated when he became a professor finally at Moscow State University, which is absolutely extraordinary given the stature of the university, that they would put him not just as a professor, but he's in charge of a whole institute in the Department of Sociology. Then I understand there were problems with his view of, he was too radical about Ukraine, and that was deemed to be inconvenient. My view, just to come back on, I don't think Dugin is informing. There was an article about Dugin, again, extraordinary, what was a year and a half ago in Foreign Affairs, no less, and it was entitled Putin's Brain. There were articles, there was a short, brief article on this subject about Dugin's influence, and they called it was entitled, I forget the name of the author, but it was entitled Putin's Brain. Just like in World War II, they went to Karl Haushofer and said, another geopolitician, and said he is the think tank, he is the factory of ideas for Nazi foreign policy. I don't think Dugin is Putin's brain in any sense. Dugin is certainly, Putin has now decided to adopt. Putin was always sympathetic to Eurasianism. I was on the Valdai Club for a couple of years, and I was able to have an interview with him in 2006, I remember, in the Kremlin, and I asked him, actually, what he thought about Eurasianism, and he absolutely refused, and Nazarbayev. I tried to connect it then with Nazarbayev, and I knew that Putin would go to Kazakhstan and would speak very sympathetically about it, but he refused to be drawn on that question. He didn't answer basically the question that I asked. Now, 2011, he's made his statement, come out of the closet, and we know that. So Dugin has been part of that. But I think Putin is very opportunistic. It seems to me, again, many greater experts on Putin than myself, but my sense is that he's very opportunistic, and he just keeps these alive. He keeps these ideas, and he takes from one from the other. The only thing I'll say is that you have two projects today. You have these ideological projects. You have on the one hand the Eurasianist project, and Dugin is one articulator, but not the only one. But you have a different one, and that's Ruski Mir. That's another project, and that's different. We're looking at this with my colleagues in Stockholm. We have a big project on this, and it's very interesting to see what the differences are. And you see there that the government is playing a little bit, and it can use certain ideas in certain directions and use others in others. So I do not agree. I think it just is incredible to me that you would entitle an article Putin's Brain, but sells the journal, I guess. Yes, Harley.
Thank you, Harley Balzer, Georgetown. One other person I'd love to bring into this discussion is Sergei Glazyev, who probably wrote that 2012 article for Putin. Mm-hmm. He is the point person for the Eurasian Economic Union. I've been following him a long time because in the 80s we did science policy together, and we actually got drunk and ended up in a tea in Birmingham when Boris Saltykov became a minister. But one of the things Glazyev has been saying is that Russian Eurasianism is unique. It kind of echoes Berdyaev. Mm-hmm. All countries are unique. Russia's more unique. Glazyev says the same thing. There are lots of these programs, but Russia's is different. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Eurasianism in comparative perspective.
Comparative with what?
With other efforts, Pan-Slavism, the German effort to rebuild the Reich. Is there anything that makes Eurasianism unusual? Or,
yes. Talking now about classical Eurasianism, in a sense, I know it almost better. I think I can answer the question better. I mean, I said, I'll try to be very brief. I said that classical Eurasianism developed this 19th century tradition of Russian nationalism, which it did. this notion of a unified, not the civilization was unified, but there was a unified geographical space as well that it corresponded to, that somehow corresponded to the political contours of the empire. So Eurasianism was following that. Of course, then the imperial boundaries would be changed quite effectively, actually, for the Soviet boundaries. That worked out pretty well. But the difference here, if one looks for a difference, I mean, there are many, but there are several, but the one difference I would talk about, which I think is very important for another aspect of Eurasianism, and that is that whereas Danilevsky, who began this, who began to think about all of this as kind of Russian space, still the Pan-Slavs and Lemansky still had this notion of the Far East and of Turkestan, Central Asia, as somehow kind of colonial. Although they didn't use the word colonial, they didn't use that term, but they thought about it. And for God's sake, Turkestan had just been annexed. In fact, when Danilevsky wrote Россия Европа, it wasn't even completely part of Russia. So one understands that this had not become assimilated into the Russian space. And if you read them carefully, you see the differences there. They're trying to come up with this kind of, but they still had these civilization differences. The Eurasians broke that mold, and the Eurasians made the radical declaration that this is one unified civilizational space, which is really very cohesive. There are different nationalities, but it is one civilizational experience, and to prove that, Savitsky went to physical geography. He actually drew on soil science, on Russian soil science, Dokuchayev and others, to try to establish the unity, the natural unity of the geographical space, which then would be the basis for the unity, the historical unity of the civilization. So that's one, I think, very important. And so when I talk about Eurasianism as being post-colonial, I really think that's very significant. It is colonialist at the same time. That's the whole conundrum of Eurasianism. But it really is, it does have this important element of post-colonialism, trying to think through Russia in a way that is, in terms of one homogeneous, sort of coherent. So that's one difference that I would talk about. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Yes, David? Michael, did you...
Question, but it builds on your question here about Dugin, but I think the broader issue is how, since you've emphasized the elasticity of the Eurasianist concept in recent years, and it's remarkable how it's been used in different ways, if you could reflect perhaps on the ideological factor and its relationship to the policy making more broadly, because it seems that, you know, Dugin, as you mentioned, is quite far from the halls of power, but there's a certain kind of context.
Yes.
So is there any way in which these ideological ideas interact directly or provide a framework for policy making? And that seems to me, if you have any thoughts on that, it's a tough issue.
Well, no, but that's what I was trying to say, what you just said, that is that precisely. I wouldn't say Putin is far from the halls of power. I think he's, you know, necessarily not that far. That probably oscillates. Sometimes he's closer. I wouldn't say he's far, but he is not Putin's brain. He's not delivering these ideas. He is providing it's like a buffet. A little bit. I mean, this is a kind of a crude comparison, but if you think about a buffet, these ideologies, so Dugin is laying out certain ways of thinking about Russia, certain narratives about Russian history, about certain imperatives, and, you know, the policymakers can go, and because they have to explain things always in Russia in ideological terms, you have to think in terms of, you know, this is sort of Russia's destiny, and this reflects historical tendencies and so on. He provides, he's very good at providing these types of ideas that can be taken up. But I don't know that his logic, he is logically influencing. This is what, but we don't know this. I mean, I should say to begin with that who knows what's influencing these ideas. If you read Putin's speeches and you're interested in these questions, you begin to see how he talks sometimes in the same way. And you think to yourself, aha, he's picking up on this line or he's picking up on that line. That's a little bit why I'm saying that, because if you kind of immerse yourself for a while in his formulations. But you know, what ultimately, but it's a melange. And again, he says, you know, he's embracing things and pursuing policies that are not Eurasianist, actually, and that are rather different, and the implications of which which he might not even foresee, are quite different. So I think this is one among many. This is what I would say. And of course, Eurasianism, just to make the final point, is not Dugin's idea. This came from Kazakhstan, the project of the Eurasia Union. My colleague Marlene Lahuel we're putting a collection together. She's also on this project in Stockholm, and her title, her chapter is entitled "How Eurasianist is the Eurasian Union." So she's even asking questions about. So there's a definite flexibility there. Thank you.